Hello, my name's Peter Gatrell and I teach history at the University of Manchester. And what I want to do today is slightly experimental. I'm not going to talk about a particular war, but I am going to talk about certain sorts of images and objects that I hope will get you thinking about today's key question, which is, how do we make sense of war? And I'm asking this question to an audience that I guess has no first-hand experience of conflict. You may have family members who have had such experience, but I guess for most of us, if not all of us in this room, the question about war is a slightly distant question. We don't, in other words, have first-hand experience. So, that being the case, how do we know what war is like? And I want to begin with what you can think of as a kind of cliche, everyday speech. When you pick up a newspaper or you watch TV or other kinds of media and you get told that we're bombarded by images of war. And those images of war are supposed to capture a conflict. So the language or the metaphor is already militarized. We're bombarded by images, and those images are supposed to capture a conflict for posterity. Now, when we think of images, we think particularly of film and of photography. And I'm going to show you a few photographs in a moment, some of which, or most of which, I hope will be unfamiliar to you. But what is an image supposed to convey in relation to war and conflict? It might be designed to get us to think about notions of bravery or heroism. But it may equally be expecting us to think about something else, like suffering, the victims of war, or the destructive impact of war. But equally, it could get us to think about the idea of surviving war, of rebuilding one's life after war is over. Now, to pursue this, I've chosen a couple of images from a Russian war photographer. He was active just before and during the Second World War on the Eastern Front. So this is the Soviet Union facing Nazi Germany from 1941 through to 1945. And he took hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs. This Russian-Jewish artist and photographer, Yevgeny Haldai. And one of the most striking ones in his collection is unnamed, and I've given it in kind of an acknowledgement of Hilary Mantel's work on Tudor England, bringing up the bodies on the Eastern Front. So we have an icy, desolate landscape here, the battlefield. The aftermath of a battle in which Nazi German troops have wreaked havoc on their Soviet enemy. And what we are left with is rather ghostly figures in this landscape who are literally going through the human remains on the battlefield in order to try and identify their loved ones. So this is partly an image of a kind that there would be many, that emphasizes clearly death, the body decomposing, but also people who are alive who are trying to recover and identify the people who were once alive and who mean something to them. But it's also, of course, something else. It's also dramatizing a kind of gendered depiction of war, since most of the figures, if not all of the figures who are alive, who are doing the searching, are women, are the wives and the mothers of those who lie dead. So it's perhaps, even though the image itself may be unfamiliar, the idea of the dead body and the people who are left behind, trying to come to terms with that loss and that pain, may itself be familiar. But here's another image from the same photographer who is now photographing in the Crimea. So this is the south of Russia, Crimea. This is the territory that Putin recently took back into Russian hands from Ukraine. But this is now 70 years ago. The German invaders have left. This is now territory that's been reoccupied by the Soviet Red Army. And Haldai gave this picture a title, Life Again, Sevastopol, May 1944. Of course, the war has another year still to run. But what's striking about this image is the rather unusual juxtaposition of the remains of battle, the ruined buildings in the background, which were once intact and have been left shelled and broken by the conflict. But Haldai has chosen to situate an adult couple in this most unlikely of situations, sunbathing on the beach in Sevastopol, looking out to sea, smiling, relaxing. And it seems to say something about life beginning again, even in the midst of this awful destruction. But it doesn't tell us very much more than that. It doesn't tell us what these people are thinking. Is that a former soldier who is now reunited with a partner or a wife, or for that matter, a sister? And we have to think for ourselves about what these people are saying to each other or are thinking. Are they saying to themselves that the danger has passed? Are they thinking that they have to, as it were, get up from the beach and take, put their uniforms back on and resume the conflict? How, in other words, will they pick up the pieces? How are they making sense of war? So these are two images. They're quite specific in time and place. This is Russia. This is the 1940s. It's the Second World War. But I want to go on to pose more general questions, which is, how do we remember war? In this instance, we have a bank of photographs that capture something of the Second World War in Russia. But of course, that question, how do we remember war, is now very timely, given that 2014 is the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War. But every war, or virtually every war, generates its own commemorative activity. What's happening now in 2014 is simply an illustration of what happens in many other conflicts as well. So the more general question, I think the more interesting question, is not that what is remembered, but how do we remember, and also, by implication, what gets forgotten or what gets overlooked, what gets marginalized. In other words, when you think to yourself, how do we commemorate war? The other question is, and what is it that we're not commemorating? What is it that's getting set to one side? So those are my starting points, but we're in Manchester Museum, and Stephen Welsh has already got some of you thinking about the material culture, the objects of war. And so what I wanted to go on to do is to ask you to think about some of the objects that are created by war, as war comes to an end, or the objects that are left behind, if you like, the detritus or the remnants of war. Now, if you think about the objects that are created as war comes to an end, you'll probably think in the first instance of things like war memorials. And I'll say a bit more about war memorials in a moment. But there are other kinds of material objects of war as well. If you saw Stephen's presentation, you'll remember that he talked about the weapons of war, whose purpose was not just to inflict injury or death, handheld weapons, clubs and axes and so forth, and swords, but objects that, apart from inflicting damage on the human body, on your enemy, were also designed to have an emotional impact, to strike fear into the minds of your enemy. But then there are other kinds of objects that seem, as it were, softer or less violent. That the objects that are left behind, if you think about regimental flags of the British Army, for example, or the uniforms that are preserved as precious, almost sacred objects. If you go into many parish churches in the UK, you will often see sometimes very tattered flags or banners that were taken from the battlefield and that are meant to not just commemorate the conflict and those who took part in it, but to evoke a kind of emotional response on the part of the witness, on the part of you, the person looking at them. And those objects, the uniform, the medals, the flags, play an important part in commemorative activity, like the remembrance ceremonies that take place not just in London at the Cenotaph, but up and down the country. Some of those flags will have been captured from the enemy. Okay, so they don't just belong, as it were, to ourselves, but to the enemy. And if you think in those terms, you're thinking about something that you call a war trophy, something that is taken from the enemy. And that's the next part of my presentation. Objects that might be taken or captured from the enemy. Here's a painting, not a photograph, by a British war artist called Paul Nash. Paul Nash, who was born in 1889 and died in 1946. And this painting was composed shortly after the Battle of Britain in 1940-41. And this is a kind of war trophy. These are German aircraft. You can see from the insignia on the wings or the fins that they're German aircraft, and they've been downed in battle by the British Royal Air Force. But they're now wrecked and lying in a kind of graveyard of weaponry in a field in Oxfordshire. And Paul Nash called this very evocatively the Dead Sea, the Totes Meer. He actually gave it the German title. And while you have that in your mind, this is what Nash wrote to accompany his painting. The thing, as it were, the object, looked to me suddenly like a great inundating sea, like a flood, in other words. The breakers rearing up and crashing on the plain, and then no, nothing moves. It's not water or even ice. It is something static and dead. Once upon a time, in other words, these were weapons of war. Now they are inert objects lying in this graveyard of weaponry. But if we think about that as a kind of trophy, what about other sorts of trophies as well, which serve a much more directly political purpose? Here we're back in Russia. So this is Moscow, June 1945. This is an extraordinary bit of choreography, political theatre, if you like, in which Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, has carefully orchestrated a victory parade to show not only the power of the Red Army, which has been victorious, but the humiliation of the Nazi enemy. And what better way of demonstrating that humiliation, that victory over the enemy, but bringing the insignia, the flags, the totems, if you like, of the Nazi war machine, and laying them at the feet of Stalin and the military leadership. So here we have a kind of almost ancient, as in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, the insignia, the war emblems being laid at the feet of your of the victor. We're back now with another kind of representation of victory. This is back in the Crimea, towards the end of the war, in which Haldane has done something very interesting. He has composed, if you like, a photograph that multiplies the helmets of the Nazi soldiers and swept them up. There's even a kind of broom in the bottom right-hand corner that is showing that once upon a time, those helmets protected the heads of human beings. But to represent the victory that we've now achieved, we don't need the bodies, because the helmets themselves stand for the subjugation, for the victory over the foe. So there's a sense in these photographs that Nazism had been defeated, but also perhaps an indication that the reconstruction of society, post-war rebuilding, would be quite challenging and costly. And I think the thought I'd like to leave you with at this point in the talk is that we have to think about how to make sense of war, but that carries with it another set of questions about how we make sense of peace also. And perhaps it's that thought that couple on the beach in Sevastopol had in their minds. So what remains behind? What remains behind are the trophies of war, the military paraphernalia, the military trophies of war. But if you think about trophies of war, you could also think about something much more troubling. I'm thinking here about body parts. Okay? Because what remains behind may be the hardware, but also the human body. And this too raises questions about war trophies. Because although it's contrary to the laws of war, contrary to the Geneva Convention of 1929, there have been episodes in which soldiers on the battlefield have seized or removed body parts. I'm going to say a little bit about skulls. But here is an image that circulated widely during the Second World War, at the same sort of time that Haldane is photographing in Sevastopol. Life magazine, a major American publication, decided to publish an image of a young woman in Arizona who has received in the post a skull of a Japanese soldier. Now, this, I think you'll realize, is very troubling, because the boyfriend has taken a conscious decision to seize this human remain and to send it thousands of miles across the ocean to Arizona. What were his motives in doing that? What are the motives of anybody in taking body parts from the enemy. Perhaps what went through his mind was the idea of a final punishment or humiliation of the enemy, a kind of desecration from the word sacred, desecration of the body. But people who've written about body parts and war trophies have said that in some instances what seems to be at stake is a kind of group solidarity, that taking body parts helps to cement a kind of loyalty amongst a small group, a troop unit. But here, what we've got is simply a souvenir. It's a kind of battlefield tourism. Field stripping is what it's called in the military. But what's also interesting is how these objects that might have seemed, dare I say it, even amusing at the time, now seem much more difficult to grasp. They're frequently now regarded as embarrassing or even transgressive. You should not do this to the enemy. Well, I'll come back to skulls in a moment. Of course, some participants do not return from war, and how are they remembered? And the most obvious example of that sense of commemorating those who don't return is the War Memorial. Okay? Now, you may well have seen some of these at first hand. The great war memorials, such as the one at Thiepval in Europe, or the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, or much closer to home in Staffordshire, the investment in recent years in the National Memorial Arboretum. But rather than talk about these, I wanted to focus for a moment upon something that I think is at least, if not more, interesting. This is a monumental piece of architecture, the All India War Memorial, otherwise known as India Gate in Delhi. And I think this is interesting as a piece of commemorative architecture for several reasons. Firstly, because it was commissioned and designed by a famous British, not an Indian architect, a British architect, Edwin Lutyens. And it was Lutyens who designed the cenotaph in London. It was Lutyens who was very active after the First World War in building various other monuments as well. If you know Bury or have visited Bury, the home of the Lancashire Fusiliers, there's a small war memorial outside the museum, and that too was designed by Lutyens, but that's on a much more human, small scale. This is monumental stuff. It was begun in 1921 and finally completed 10 years later, and it was designed to commemorate Indian troops who'd served the British Empire during the First World War, the Indian troops who'd lost their lives during the war. But it's also significant because the current government in India is uneasy about this as a status, as a war memorial, because it's become part of the everyday fabric of the city of Delhi. And what the current government is trying to do is to explore the possibility of building a separate war memorial that would be close to the original, but would not be a place that people mill around and traffic drives through, but something much more separate and even sacred. But there's another reason why I find this monument interesting, and that's because close by is another war memorial. And this was built after 1971. In 1971, as you may know, there was a war between Pakistan and India, a war that led to the creation of the state of Bangladesh. And Indian troops participated in this war nearly 30 years after the Second World War. And the Indian government has its own separate memorial to commemorate those who lost their lives in the battle that culminated in the formation of the state of Bangladesh. And this memorial is also interesting because some architect, with the approval of the government, has decided we're not going to build something monumental, we're not going to have something with a human figure, what we're going to do is another helmet and a rifle. So it's very deliberate that the object that the memorial wants to create is deliberately chosen to focus upon hardware, if you like, rather than the human figure. But finally, this memorial is to not to the victims of the war, but to the soldiers who lost their lives. Because the war in 1971-72 was a war that also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians as well. And they don't have a war memorial. It's a military rather than a civilian construction. As I round things off, I want to come back to the Second World War for a moment. Of all the images that I'm showing, this one or something like it may be the most familiar, but also one of the most devastating. Again, this is not the human body or body parts. This is what's left behind after the extermination of Jews in the Holocaust, in this case at Auschwitz. And what's left behind are piles of shoes and other belongings in the background. And what I find, and I hope you also find compelling about this, is that the making sense of this war is achieved partly through dramatizing the scale of destruction by piling one object on top of another, an everyday object, footwear, on top of others. But when I saw this image, I was also struck by something that is almost 100 years older than this. This is another painting. This is not a photograph. And I think this is endlessly fascinating as an image. It's by a Russian war artist whose name is very difficult to pronounce, but it's Vasily Vereshchagin. And Vereshchagin, we would now call him a war artist or a war correspondent. He was present when Russian troops were engaged in one of the periodic wars of conquest of Central Asia. So in the 1860s, what you should imagine is the Russian army, this is Tsarist Russia, this is well before the revolution, this is the Russian Tsarist army conquering Central Asia and incorporating it into the Russian Empire. Okay? Many of the enemies were Muslim. So this is a war for the conquest of Central Asia. What I want to pose as a question is Vereshchagin trying to do with this image? I think one of the things he may be doing is suggesting power, the power of the victor over the vanquished. The vanquished lie simply piled up as a mountain of skulls on which crows are feeding in this desolate desert landscape. But I think there is also a sense in which Vereshchagin, and this is why people who looked at it at the time were very troubled by it, Vereshchagin was also saying something about the pity of war. The apotheosis of war is about the magnificence of a Russian victory, but there's also something about the pity in the eye of the viewer who's left to contemplate what the victor did to the vanquished. Now, if you were looking at this in the 1870s in Moscow in the Tretyakov Gallery, which is where the picture still is, you would know, probably because of your background and education, that Vereshchagin was also referencing something called Golgotha. Golgotha, the place of skulls. Golgotha, the place in the Bible, drawing attention to where Jesus was crucified, the valley or the place of skulls. And I think that's another allusion or reference that Vereshchagin was making. But the skull is a very powerful way of thinking about war in other senses as well. Here's a German artist, Otto Dix. You can find out more of his work if you go to the fantastic exhibition that's currently running just down the road at the City Art Gallery, Sensory War, co-curated by one of my colleagues. There's an enormous wealth of material there to get you thinking about war. But Otto Dix is one of the people represented in that exhibition. Dix was a war artist who grew incredibly angry at the waste and suffering in the First World War. And here we have his image of the skull. So this is 10 years after the war broke out. And what Dix wanted to do was to ram home to his audience that what's left behind is a skull on which worms feed. Not the heroism of battle, not the might of mobilization, but ultimately it all comes down to this, to the individual skull that's the remnant of war. So Vereshchagin's pile of skulls, Otto Dix the single skull. And the power of the skull remains. We're now Cambodia. We're now in the aftermath of the genocide wreaked by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. And when the post-war government of Cambodia wanted to try and dramatize the effect of genocide, of mass slaughter, it decided to do something quite extraordinary, and you may think even grotesque, which is to not just create a museum to the genocide, Tuol Seng in the capital, Phnom Penh, but to actually recreate a map of the country in the shape of human skulls. And a few bones to represent the different provinces of the country. And I think so uncomfortable was this that the government more than 10 years ago decided that enough was enough. We can't have this in the museum. We'll dismantle it. But again, the way in which war, conflict, seems to encourage different uses of the human skull as a kind of way of thinking about war. And I want to end by going back to footwear. You'll recall the very striking and powerful image of the mountain of footwear left behind after the Holocaust. We know what became of Jews who were killed, mass murder, exterminated during the war, but something left behind was their footwear. And I leave you with this final image because this is the everyday object. This isn't the gun, this isn't the aircraft in Paul Nash's painting, this isn't the gun in that monument in India to the war of 1971. This is footwear. And we have here an American relief worker helping one of the victims of war to look for shoes that fit. And so shoes are not exactly trophies of war, but their very ordinariness makes them seem extraordinary in the light of what we know about the war and concentration camps and the Holocaust. So I want to leave you with the final thought that what's left behind can be extraordinary and monumental, the huge war memorial. It can be deeply troubling, the skull, the trophy of war, Or it could simply be something as everyday and even banal as footwear. But even the humble shoe can get us thinking and trying to make sense of war. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, no escaping the microphone here. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, why were the skulls mainly represented as a sign of trophy? I know that the pirates also had a flag that had a skull and bones on top of it, and many in historical, such as Egyptians, did skull shaping and shaped the skulls in a different way, which is unnatural to mankind, with using bandages. And does that have a connection towards it?
I think what you're saying is really important, that my images are all basically modern, but they reference a kind of much longer tradition, if you like, of representation. You might want to go back as far as Greece and Rome, for example, or other ancient civilizations. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about, but which you make me think about, is the use of bones as objects of saintly relics in churches. So not a direct connection with war, but trying to emphasize someone's like spiritual significance. Or there's a famous church in the Czech Republic that is the church of skulls, of bones. There's nothing but bones in that church. So you're right, there's a kind of long line or long tradition of using bones, and particularly skulls, for spiritual or other purposes. I suppose what I was trying to do in my talk is to get you to think about, as it were, taking skulls out of that, if you like, sacred realm, and getting you to think about how the skull also informs ideas of war, what's left behind. In the Dick's image, he's trying to say something about the skull as the only thing that's left behind. When we've stopped talking about famous battles or victories, that is ultimately the residue or the remnant that's left behind. In Cambodia, I mean, I've never been to Cambodia, but I've seen lots of photographs on news bulletins about this, because that's the victims of the genocide. Their skeletons remain behind, or were disinterred and put on display, so that you had shelves of skulls to dramatize the genocide. But turning the genocide into the country, turning the skulls into the country, seems to be an extraordinary further step. And I'm not sure whether Stephen talked about this in his presentation, but he certainly talked to me about the way in which these Japanese skulls circulated as kind of objects during the Second World War, and ended up in the hands of American servicemen, and one ended up in Manchester, and the family was uncomfortable about holding on to this, and asked the museum here to take charge of the skull. And because of the sensitivity of this, the decision was taken quite properly that this skull should be repatriated to Japan, and a lot of that has happened over recent years. The proper place, in other words, for this skull, the respectful place where they belong, is back in Japan. But it's only 70 years ago that the idea of taking body parts was not offensive or unusual, and the Vietnam War is another example where there are stories of body parts, ears, and so forth being cut away from the enemy and turned into necklaces, for goodness sake. But I'm very grateful to you for drawing attention to the fact that a lot of this is modern, but it's not entirely about the modern world either.
How come with the like the Holocaust, like the the one that you showed us with the pile of shoes and clothes.
Yeah.
How come, like, someone wanted to specifically take a picture of that? Was it to show power, or was it? It's just like to add like an impact, you know, like to a normal person.
I can't answer that question directly, but I think it's a good question to ask, and your answer and the answer of other people will be just as valid as anything I could offer. If you want me to try and answer it, clearly, as concentration camps were being cleared, some of them, most famously Belsen, was torched, was burnt to the ground after the British liberated it in 1945. Other decisions were taken with other concentration camps, clearly Auschwitz, obvious example, that something would have to remain as a kind of physical testament to what one group of humans had done to another group. And purely speculatively, I think what's happening here is that someone was not just doing something very, if you like, straightforward, I will sweep these shoes and pile them up. But even if they were, someone else, either the photographer, was wanting to compose an image that would dramatize the consequences of what became known as the Holocaust.
You know, like in the past, like you were the 18th century one with the skulls.
19th century, yeah.
Yeah. Was it like the like almost like the impact of the kind of skulls and sentimental things? Was that to rebel, or is it to?
It's the impact. I think you have to put yourself in the mind of someone in the 1870s who's grown up probably reading some newspapers about the glorious victories of the Russians in Central Asia. Goes to an art gallery and expects to see pictures which they would have shown of, men on horseback, fine uniforms, putting down the rebels, as so-called, in what's modern day, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and would suddenly come across this. I mean, you can imagine the shock of being confronted by that. And I think Vereshchagin was saying this is about the kind of might of the Russian Empire, that it's able to, as it were, not only defeat the enemy, but humiliate them by piling skull upon skull. And yet there's a kind of ambivalence there. The ambivalence comes from being the might of Russia and the humiliation exemplified by the skulls, but there was also a sense of, what have we done? What are we doing here? The justification is that we, the Russians, are bringing civilization to the barbaric Asian tribes. And this is our civilization, please. This is what civilization means, a pile of skulls. You can see how the meanings are multi-layered. It's not straightforward, which is why the Tsar came to visit the exhibition and this is not what he expected to see. Not what he expected to see. But Vereshchagin could paint some really horrible, powerful paintings. He painted one of the British putting down the Great Revolt of 1857 in India, and the things that he shows there of the executions, the manner of the execution that the British inflicted on the Indian rebels, are as uncomfortable to look at as, I guess, would be to look at the ISIS videos. Yeah.
You mentioned the war memorial in Delhi for the war between India and Pakistan was purely a military one. Do you think there is any value in separately commemorating military losses, or do you think that it's more useful to remember all victims of war together?
I have a particular interest in refugee history, and there are countless occasions in the 20th century where what happens to civilians who are forced to flee tends to get written out of the story. So I'm already kind of sensitive to the idea of what war memorials say, but also what they don't say. But of course it's rather more complicated than that. A couple of examples of what I mean by complicated. One is, I don't know whether anyone would like to show hands. Has anyone been to the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, so this is close to Birmingham, but it's a huge complex that over the last 10 years, I can't remember how many years it's been going, has become populated by different war memorials. Mostly military. But it's very interesting how, in trying to think about what you're going to put in this site, there are some slightly unconventional memorials. I attended a year or two back the unveiling of a Quaker memorial. Now, the Quakers famously did not fight. They were pacifists, they were conscientious objectors. So at one corner, it's not central, it's sort of on the margins, in this War Memorial Arboretum, or this National Memorial Arboretum, there's a place reserved for people who worked on ambulances, didn't have guns, but helped to look after people who were wounded, were sometimes killed because they were bombed. But they weren't fighting forces. So some war memorials make room for that civilian, so to speak, component as well. If you've never been to the War Memorial Arboretum, you can Google it and see some of the memorials. The most popular one, the one that kids go to, you go to the War Memorial and there are school parties of very young kids. The one they all go to is one which is a kind of little forest of trunks of trees, like 10, 20, 30 of these trees. That's all they are, trunks of trees. And you probably guessed what they are. It's called Shot at Dawn. This is a memorial to people who were accused of cowardice, sometimes 15 or 16-year-olds. Okay, and it commemorates those as kind of victims of war. So it's not a conventional war memorial. It's got a memorial to conscientious objectors, so to speak. It's got a memorial to people who were called cowards at the time. So that's one answer to your question. The other thing that I think complicates it is what is a war memorial? Sometimes it's grand, the big Teepval, on the Somme, or the Delhi India Gate. You can imagine the kind of enormous, monstrous monuments that are created. But then, in villages, Britain, but also France, for example, much more modest, almost kind of intimate war memorials of a soldier, often, kind of posed soldier, sculpture. But then some have a female figure as well. Some of the great Civil War, American Civil War monuments or memorials have a female figure. It's also kind of goes back to kind of Judeo-Christian ideas of Mother of Christ, the Pietà, mother holding a young man. So it's not as if it's all about the soldier. Sometimes it's about the suffering person who's left behind, which a loved one, a mother, or a partner. So I think that also complicates things. But in general, you have to ask, I think, as I was trying to do at the beginning, what's in the memorial and what's not.